December 23, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. General Hasso von Manteuffel believed that the city would fall in 3 days. Surrounded, isolated and frozen, all she had to do was wait. Their grenadiers, buried in snow-covered trenches, watched the horizon line with mathematical tranquility. No supplies had come in, no troops had left. It was for the Germans just another siege operation, executed with discipline, surrounded by logic, blessed by the weather. This logic was about to be destroyed not by tanks, but by barrels, not by divisions, but by spreadsheets. At noon, the silence was broken by a sound that no Wehrmacht manual predicted. A constant, full-bodied roar approached, and then the sky filled with wings. 241 U.S. transport planes appeared as a manufactured avalanche. Through them, the American nation poured food, ammunition, plasma, surgeries and fuel right over the siege. Physics curved. Geography became irrelevant. This video reconstructs the day Germany realized that it wasn't just besieging a city, it was besieging an industrial civilization, and that this civilization flew. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story more than any explosion or tactical breakthrough. During the siege of Bastogne, while the 101st Airborne resisted with hand-counted rations and cartridge-by-cartridge divided ammunition, the United States managed to drop, in the middle of winter, more than 1,100 tons of supplies, by air, under fire, with precision. In a single day, 241 planes crossed the Belgian skies and turned the impossible into a logistical routine. The Luftwaffe, which once terrorized the continent, was barely able to react. What seemed like a desperate operation revealed something bigger. America didn't just resupply, it flew over traditional military logic with the coldness of a spreadsheet and the force of a radial engine. If you value stories like this, where details change everything, where technology conquers despair, where history reveals its engineering, leave your like and subscribe. This allows us to continue bringing to light the technical backstage of the war, where the invisible battles that defined the century were fought. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 a.m., the earth shook under the largest artillery barrage ever fired by the German army since Stalingrad. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Vigil on the Rhine, began with the arrogance of those who believed that they could still turn the tide of the war with a bold move. For Hitler, Bastogne was not just a city, it was a bottleneck. 7 main roads crisscrossed that small Belgian town, and with them the entire logistical backbone of the Allies in the Ardennes region. Cutting them off meant dividing armies, slowing down reinforcements, and hopefully capturing Antwerp. But for the plan to work, Bastogne needed to fall, and fast. The German command devised a simple maneuver: advance at speed, encircle the city before the Americans understood what was happening, and let winter and famine do the dirty work. There would be no need to waste tanks or ammunition. It was a technical, disciplined, efficient siege. All you had to do was control the weather and hope that the sky would remain closed. During the first few days, everything seemed to confirm the German forecast. Inexperienced and resting troops defended the front. American units retreated in panic. Some were surrounded, others disappeared into the forest. The tactical surprise was total. The weather, thick, still, laden with mist and ice, kept the skies silent. No American aircraft took off. The silence on the radio was absolute. The Allied command was disoriented, trying to understand if this attack was localized or the beginning of something bigger. Meanwhile, the panzer divisions were advancing with confidence. Von Lüttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps was tasked with encircling Bastogne. At his side, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, commanded by Hasso Kokott, composed of veterans of the Eastern Front, mixed with Luftwaffe replacements and Marines, conducted the containment operation. The orders were clear: isolate, block, economize. The doctrine was old, but still valid. A well-executed siege was cheaper than a frontal assault. And with the cold in his favor, the American surrender was only a matter of time. Confidence was such that, on the 22nd, with the siege consolidated, German armored units were deployed to continue the offensive towards the Meuse River. Only infantry regiments remained around the city, believing that the Americans, without food, without heat, and without ammunition, would surrender in a maximum of 72 hours. General Luttwitz even stated that Bastogne would be a victory without noise, an economic, dry, clean triumph. What he didn't know, and what almost no German commander knew, was what lurked across the ocean. American logistics, though invisible on tactical maps, had become the most decisive weapon of the war. By 1944, the United States was producing 96,000 aircraft a year, nearly triple what Germany could keep in the air. Every hour of American combat was sustained by an industrial chain that involved 18 million workers, thousands of trains, and a rail and naval network that transported supplies with surgical precision. At this point, it's worth pausing. During the Ardennes campaign, the United States had an average of 3,000 transport aircraft available in Europe. Germany, in that same period, had just over 300 cargo aircraft, most of which were already obsolete, a disproportion of almost 10 to 1. If this data surprised you, write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because that's exactly what started to happen. Every day that the atmosphere remained closed, the Germans smiled. It was as if nature was collaborating, but this collaboration was temporary and deeply misleading. By surrounding Bastogne and believing that time would do the job, the Germans unwittingly created a perfect stage. They weren't just locking down a city. They were challenging a country that, unlike Germany, did not need roads. The mistake was not tactical, it was civilizational. The German doctrine of the Blitzkrieg, based on speed, surprise, and concentrated force, had not been designed to withstand a long attrition and replacement war. What began as a tactical advantage, lightning encirclement, would soon reveal its structural limitation. Germany had the formula for victory in 1940, but in 1944 it faced a war that required more than tanks. It required tons. Each day that Bastogne remained isolated, the Germans celebrated another stage of victory. But the Americans, even if silent, were already moving. An order crossed radio stations, depots, and airstrips. Reinforce Bastogne by air, whatever the cost. And this order was no longer just a military issue. It was a demonstration of capacity. General Eisenhower quickly understood what was at stake. The fall of Bastogne did not only mean the loss of a city, it meant a destroyed symbol, a moral breaking point in the midst of the German counter-offensive. The decision was made. The sky would have to be opened by force. And when that happened, it wouldn't just be an air bridge. It would be an exhibition. The ultimate irony, the German belief that the weather itself would guarantee victory. But what they called fog, Americans called backwardness. And when it dissipated, what would appear in the sky would not only be airplanes, it would be factories flying. Behind the scenes, the crews of the 9th Transport Troops Command were already preparing. The freighters would be fueled in record time. New types of parachutes had been developed just for this type of launch. The code was clear. Bastogne would not fall, and from the moment time allowed, nothing would stop what would come from heaven. As the German offensive advanced with unexpected speed through the forests of the Ardennes, a group of American soldiers was hastily awakened in the French countryside. They were young, exhausted, and had spent the last few days trying to catch their breath after weeks of intense combat. They were the men of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. By the time the order came, there was no time for questions or assurances. They climbed into open trucks, unprepared, with clothes too light for the cold that awaited them. Some wore only a blanket over their shoulders. Others wore makeshift boots. The destination was Bastogne, a city with a small name, but one that would soon become the center of gravity of the war in Western Europe. During the early morning hours of December 18th, the column crossed the frozen roads of northern France under an overcast sky. The information was fragmented. The maps were outdated. What they knew was only the essentials. The Germans had launched a massive counteroffensive, and in their way, Bastogne was the most critical point. If it fell, Antwerp would become a mirage. The division was not sent to regain territory. It was sent to stop a hemorrhage, to ensure at any cost. They arrived in the city a few hours before the last routes were cut off. Some officers soberly acknowledged that they had arrived only 4 hours before the first panzer units sighted the urban limits. The line of defense had to be set up immediately. Men who had barely landed were already digging holes in the snow, positioning machine guns, trying to guess where the first attack would come from. The houses were transformed into improvised medical posts. The basements in bomb shelters. Field hospitals have sprung up where bakeries once stood. The cold was a separate enemy. That week, temperatures reached 20 degrees C, and many soldiers did not even have proper gloves. The fuel supply for heaters was minimal. Wood was torn from furniture, doors and windows, and yet the men of the 101st resisted. With a combination of obstinacy, discipline and faith in the arrival of reinforcements that they didn't know would come, faith in supplies they couldn't ask for, faith in a rearguard that might no longer exist. It was a besieged army, but above all, it was a besieged symbol. The city of Bastogne, at that time, gathered a patchwork of forces. In addition to the 101st, there were elements of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, engineers, doctors, cooks, drivers. It was not an elite army. It was an army of circumstance, and it was enough. On the German side, the surprise was bitter. It was expected to find an empty city or one with symbolic resistance. Instead, they found well-positioned units, organized in a flexible defensive perimeter, with interconnected resistance points and efficient reconnaissance. The roads were mined, bridges demolished. Every intersection, every bend in the forest hid an ambush. There were not enough tanks to break through, nor enough infantry to fully encircle. The siege was technical, but it was not hermetic, and that changed everything. The presence of the 101st caused an immediate logistical problem for the German command. They could no longer ignore Bastogne. What was supposed to be a crossing became a whirlwind. Hitler, upon learning of American resistance, ordered Bastogne to be taken immediately. "Bastogne is the key to everything," he said, but it wouldn't be. It would be the thorn in the logic of the offensive. In practice, the soldiers of the 101st were at the limit from day one. Ammunition was rationed. Each cartridge was counted. At some points, grenades were passed from hand to hand like relics. The MRE rations had run out in the first week. The supply of morphine, bandages and plasma was inferior even to what the Germans could carry on mules. The artillery fired with extreme moderation. The radios operated on frozen batteries. But in the midst of this lack, there was something that neither cold, nor hunger, nor siege could break: discipline. Officers such as Colonel Harry Kinnard reorganized the defense sectors, accurately calculated the most vulnerable points, distributed small reserves with millimeter efficiency. It was the logic of an army trained not only to win, but to resist, and to turn resistance into a message. General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the division, proceeded to visit each point on the perimeter, encouraging the men with a short, to-the-point phrase, "Hold on a little longer," and they endured. The enemy still believed that it was desperation. It wasn't. It was preparation. As the German soldiers surrounded the city, confident that they were facing a group about to give way, they did not realize that the 101st was already operating under another kind of logic, that of time. It was enough to resist one more day. Perhaps the weather would open up. Perhaps something would appear on the horizon. The doubt that was beginning to corrode the besiegers was not yet visible, but it was there. in the suppressed sound of machine guns that wouldn't shut up, in the attacks that couldn't break through, in the nights when American positions remained intact. Inside, there was no miracle. There was mathematics. Kinnaird organized the defenses based on maps, altimetry, and supply estimates that only he knew were insufficient. But the 101st didn't need to win. He needed to survive. And that's what they did. Survived. To the cold, to the siege, to the scarcity, to the bombardment, and to the logic of surrender. Because somewhere, behind the ice and clouds, they knew someone was trying to open the sky. And when the sky opened, he would not come with prayers. It would come with weight, speed, and parachute. And that's exactly what the Germans didn't foresee, that the besieged were waiting not for a way out, but for a signal. And that signal, when it arrived, would have no voice. It would have engines. On December 20th, 1944, at noon, the siege of Bastogne was completed with geometric precision. All 7 roads leading to the city were under German control. No supply route remained open. No withdrawal line possible. The troops of the 101st Airborne, reinforced by elements of the 10th Armored Division, combat engineers, and anti-tank gunners, were totally isolated. The cold hardened everything: the soil, the nerves, the bodies. The Wehrmacht command watched from their positions in the nearby hills with the methodical tranquility of one who believed they were in absolute control of time and destiny. The siege was technically perfect. No extra shots would be wasted. American surrender was a matter of days or starvation. The lines of communication had been cut. The radios operated under interference and battery shortages. Night temperatures exceeded 15 degrees C. Few American troops had adequate clothing. Many wore makeshift layers, piling socks over their hands like gloves, newspapers like thermal insulation. Each man had orders to conserve ammunition. Mortars were only being used when the psychological impact was more valuable than the physical damage. Food was redistributed daily, with packages cut in half, rationing counted by grams. The stock of morphine was so low that doctors began to reuse needles. Some wounded died not from their injuries, but from the lack of means to treat them. On the German side, confidence became complacency. The operation was seen as a model of modern siege. No direct attack would be necessary. The tanks of the 47th Panzer Corps continued their march towards the Meuse River, abandoning Bastogne to the infantry. Why waste armored vehicles and fuel in a city that, according to German calculations, was already doomed? Time, hunger, and fear would do the work that panzer divisions could avoid. The German command believed that Bastogne would fall by Christmas. From a logistical point of view, this expectation was built on an almost plausible statistical reasoning. Under normal conditions, a besieged force of 22,000 men, with no external access to supplies, would consume an average of 40 tons of food and fuel per day. With extreme rationing, this demand could drop to 25 tons. Even so, impossible to supply by land. As the skies remained closed by fog and American aircraft were on the ground, the German calculations seemed foolproof. Bastogne was isolated, not only physically, but logistically. But it was exactly at this point that logic began to fail. What the Germans didn't calculate was the invisible factor, the American doctrine of deep supply. Since 1943, the United States had reorganized its entire military structure to depend on the industrial rearguard. Each combat division was just the tip of a production chain. A battalion of the 101st might have been isolated in a European village, but behind it was Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Ford Motor Company, Douglas Aircraft, Union Pacific. It was a war fought by forklift operators, by inventory counters, by parachute designers. While the German command bet on time as an ally, the Allied headquarters treated time as a variable to be overcome. The U.S. Air Force had entire manuals dedicated to refueling missions under siege, Previous experiences in Sicily and Italy had proven that airdrop was not a plan B. It was a plan in development. The C-47s were ready. The pilots knew what to do. The packages were stored. There was only a 6-hour window with visibility missing. The most brutal irony? The German decision itself to surround Bastogne and not ignore it turned the city into a symbol. A symbol demands a response. From the moment the siege closed, the Allies knew they could not allow the fall of the 101st, not only for military reasons, but moral, psychological, political. In the days that followed, the Germans began small probing attacks. All were repelled. Not for numerical superiority, the Americans were outnumbered, out of supplies and with little artillery, but for positioning, discipline and internal communication. Although cut from the outside, the internal sectors of the city worked as a synchronized gear. Each platoon knew where to retreat, who to report to, what to expect. This confused the German reports, which expected a disorganized garrison and encountered articulate resistance. Even so, the German plan remained the same. Wait. The messages sent by von Lüttwitz to the higher command reiterated, Bastogne will soon fall. General Kokott kept his reports laconic and optimistic. The morale of the German troops was stable. They were certain that Americans were slowly dying, and they were, but they were also doing calculations. Inside the city, officers of the 101st, led by Kinnard, estimated the remaining stockpiles. What they had would be enough for 4, maybe 5 days, with absolute rationing. After that, the collapse would begin, but no one made plans to surrender. The focus was on holding out until the weather cleared up. It was a game of hours. The thermometer was more relevant than any machine gun. In a German report captured days later, an officer noted, "The Americans still resist, but they should not last until Christmas." He was partly right. Bastogne would not fall until Christmas, and it would never fall, because when Christmas came, the sky had changed, and with it would come numbers that no earthly doctrine could contain. On the morning of December 23rd, the sky cleared for the first time in 8 days. In less than 4 hours, 241 aircraft were prepared, fueled, lined up and launched. It was the beginning of a response that would not be military, it would be industrial. And the first wave wasn't the end. It was just the prologue. On the morning of December 22nd, 1944, as the first pale rays of sunlight filtered through the thick clouds of Bastogne, 2 German officers crossed the front line with white flags and a sealed document. They marched with firm steps, sure of victory. They came not to negotiate, they came to formalize what they believed to be inevitable, the American surrender. Bringing blindfolds to the eyes of the commanders of the 101st, the Germans were certain that their enemies would accept the logic of encirclement, of scarcity, of progressive annihilation. All you had to do was sign, cover your eyes, and accept fate. The document demanded immediate, unconditional surrender, on pain of total annihilation by heavy artillery. Indeed, the answer came hours later in a handwritten note with a single word: nuts, crazy, incredible, unacceptable. Anthony McAuliffe, acting general of the 101st Airborne, did not use elaborate phrases. When informed of the German demand, his reaction was spontaneous, almost comical. "Nuts!" he exclaimed. His officers laughed. But there, in that dry and absurd word, a code was hidden. It was more than denial. It was mockery, a challenge, a direct message: you don't understand what we are defending. The German delegation did not immediately understand. The interpreters were asked, "What does that mean?" They replied, "It means, go yourself." That word echoed among the soldiers like an unspoken scream. Nuts became a password, a watchword, immediate memory, repeated in the trenches, written on the walls, whispered among the shrapnel. It symbolized what the numbers couldn't explain, that even without enough ammunition, without heating, without an escape route, they wouldn't accept it. The siege was absolute, but surrender was an illusion. To the Germans, that was foolishness. It didn't make military sense. Commander Kokot even recorded in his diary that the Americans had lost their minds, and that was the key. Because for those who saw the war as an equation of supplies and losses, the American response seemed crazy. But for those who understood that there was something more, something intangible between the logistical lines, the word was clear: faith. In practice, nothing changed that day. No reinforcements arrived, no bombs stopped falling, no route was opened. But the morale of the 101st rose with more strength than any convoy could bring. It was confirmation that they still had a voice. They could still say no. They were not dead yet. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Germans viewed American behavior as suicidal because they did not understand what sustained them. It wasn't just supplies. It was an entire ecosystem about to move. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts and understanding the technical and moral backstage of this war, show your support, like and subscribe. It helps us to continue reconstructing these invisible layers of history. And if nuts was the symbolic point of resistance, what came after was the physical point of the turnaround. Because the next day, the heavens finally opened, and with them, the sound that would destroy silence. On the morning of December 23rd, 241 C-47s would appear as a speck in the sky over Bastogne. And with each parachute deployed, the German besiegers would realize, in silence, that this word was not madness. It was a warning. On the morning of December 23rd, Bastogne woke up different. After 8 days of being plunged into fog, snow, and darkness, something rare happened. The sky opened up. It was a fragile blue, faint but sufficient. The first rays of sunlight pierced the frozen canopies of the Ardennes and illuminated for the first time since the beginning of the siege the hardened faces of the 101st. In the German trenches, the weather also seemed to bring relief. Some soldiers came out of the shelters to breathe. For the first time in days, the engines of the American bombers were not heard. There didn't even seem to be movement at the front. But then, in the distance, a strange sound, grave, pulsating, continuous. It was not artillery, it was not an attack, it was something new, a noise that started low but grew like a tide of steel. At 11 a.m., the first group of aircraft appeared on the horizon. They were C-47 Skytrains, also called Dakota, twin-engine transport aircraft with a capacity of almost 3 tons of cargo each. But they were not alone. They were followed by entire squadrons, more than 200, flying in perfect formation. Behind them, escorts of P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt fighters protected the air corridors. The operation was massive, synchronized, rehearsed to the smallest detail. It was the result of months of training, operational manuals, and industrial capacity. Each C-47 carried dozens of containers attached to colorful parachutes. It was more than supply, it was a visual language. Red, ammunition. Blue, plasma and surgical supplies. Yellow, food. White, blankets and warm clothing. The packages began to fall into areas previously marked by identification panels placed by American soldiers. In a matter of minutes, the entire sky was alive, not with bombs, but with aid. It was as if the rear of the United States had jumped the ocean and landed directly on the encirclement. For the Germans, the impact was immediate and devastating. The anti-aircraft lines, prepared for fighters and bombers, were not configured to intercept tactical convoys at medium altitude. Some shots were fired, but ineffective. The speed of the operation and the sheer number of aircraft made any attempt at interruption futile. The Luftwaffe, reduced and absent, did not even manage to take off. The air superiority of the United States at that time was so overwhelming that the Germans did not even respond with fighter jets. Bastogne's floor was covered with color. Each American unit rushed to its collection zone. Trucks, jeeps, horses, and even makeshift sleds mobilized to retrieve the containers before they fell into enemy hands. But the precision of the pilots was millimetric. Most of the launches fell exactly where they needed to be. At some points, parachutes descended directly inside command posts or field hospitals. A surgeon would later report, "We had been out of plasma for 2 days. When I saw that blue package fall, I started crying. The cargo delivered was more than 144 tons in a single day. 30 and 50 ammunition, grenades, bazookas, sea rations, combat biscuits, sleeping bags, thermal boots, antibiotics, anesthetics, fuel, radio batteries, engineering tools, spare parts for artillery. Each item was the result of a logistics chain that began in factories in the American Midwest, crossed the Atlantic on Liberty ships, crossed France by reconstructed rails, and ended with precision in parachutes over a besieged city. But what descended on Bastogne that day was not just supply, it was humiliation. General Cocotte, who was watching the scene from an outpost north of the city, later wrote, "I have never seen anything like it. It was as if the sky was pouring an entire city on us." But he wasn't wrong. German doctrine did not foresee this. The siege had been designed to win with economy, of ammunition, of effort, of time. But what the Americans were now demonstrating was that time, effort, and ammunition were far from over. And more, that was not improvisation, it was planning. The use of visual codes on the parachutes, the coordination with the ground crews, the interval between launches, the flight patterns, everything had been rehearsed. The mission was possible because the Americans had a system that began with a radio order at Bastogne, proceeded to logistical HQs in the rear, passed through dispatch centers, and ended with a pilot in the cockpit of a C-47 with an exact list of cargo, altitude, speed, and release point. And this system was impossible to replicate because it wasn't just military, it was civilizational. Germany still relied on individual heroism, on the field commander, on tactical maneuvering. The United States trusted the engineer, the radio operator, the freight forwarder. It was a war between idealizations. And on that day, industry won over ideology. The most impressive? That was just the first day. Over the next 3 days, more than 700 refueling flights would be carried out. The U.S. Air Command would organize specific corridors, no-fly zones, and launch protocols that would run like clockwork, a logistical schedule designed to overcome the winter and the siege. And so it was that in the middle of the snow, with the city surrounded and the weapons freezing in their hands, the men of the 101st smiled again. Because that day, the sound of the radial engine was more powerful than any speech, and the Germans, on the other side, were beginning to realize that they were besieging the wrong place. A German soldier, captured days later, said in testimony, "When I saw the sky covered by those planes, I realized that we were fighting against something we did not understand, but they would understand." In the next part, what would come down from heaven would not only be supplies, it would be fire, because the C-47s would not come alone, and the next roar would bring something much more lethal. The Americans screamed, ran, carried colorful packages in their arms as if rescuing children. Some cried with relief, others laughed soundlessly, too exhausted to comprehend the extent of what had just happened. But while the trenches of the 101st vibrated on the German side, what could be heard was silence, a silence of calculation. Officers watched through binoculars, dumbfounded. Were there 200? 300? No. There were 241 transport planes, emerging from the south as an organized swarm, each of them capable of carrying the equivalent of the daily supply of an entire battalion. And they did not come empty. They came with everything. Tons of rations, 30 and 50 ammunition, gallons of avgas fuel, refrigerated blood plasma, surgical kits, long-range radios, thermal blankets, new boots, spare parts for mortars and artillery. There was more technology and resources there in mid-flight than some entire Wehrmacht divisions still had in the field. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire with everything they had. The sky was streaked by green traces, crackles, flashes, but nothing stopped the formation. Some C-47s were hit. One of them, on fire, lost an engine. Still, its pilot stayed the course. It only deviated when the last parachute was deployed, after releasing the entire shipment over the American perimeter. He fell minutes later into a frozen forest. The Germans who witnessed this did not see heroism. They saw obedience to a higher logic. Those men were not delivering packages. They were fulfilling an equation. In American doctrine, the front line was only the last stage of a chain. Each soldier at Bastogne was supported by dozens, sometimes hundreds of people: technicians, steelworkers, drivers, designers, radar operators, dispatchers, test pilots, civil engineers. Each parachute launched that morning carried a collective signature. A project not of courage, but of system. Meanwhile, the Germans lived the opposite extreme. Its logistics lines were collapsing. Rail trains no longer reached Belgium. The tanks relied on limited stocks of synthetic fuel refined at power plants that were being bombed daily by the Allied Air Force. Ammunition was redistributed sparingly. Many divisions went days without receiving reinforcements. Shortages weren't just a problem. It was the new normal. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, which surrounded Bastogne from the north, operated at less than half of its original artillery endowment. Many of his soldiers used repurposed Czech rifles, with ammunition incompatible with German standards. The cold destroyed engines, froze lubricants, eroded morale, and then, in the face of all this, they watched a parade of aerial abundance. It was as if they were surrounding a city supplied by another planet. What most shocked German observers was the repetition. This was not a one-time effort, a desperate attempt to break the siege. It was just the first wave. The planes came in waves. Each formation was replaced by another. The precision of the throws indicated not improvisation, but routine. There was a hidden methodology there, a science of resupply under fire. What's more, the C-47s were not alone. Flying over the formation were P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, armed with rockets and bombs, ready to protect the operation at any cost. No German air threat could even get close. Air supremacy was total. At one of the German command posts, an officer reportedly said, "This is not a war, it's a mass production." And he was right. World War II, at that point, had overtaken the field of maneuver. It was no longer about tactics. It was about who could keep his soldiers fed, armed, warm, and confident. In an internal estimate made by the Luftwaffe command that same day, it was calculated that to replicate a refueling mission like the one at Bastogne, Germany would need 600 operational transport planes, 200 escort fighters, trained crews, jet fuel, and forward air control. None of this existed anymore in 1944. The Luftwaffe was, that winter, a statistical shadow. The logistical gulf between the two armies became impossible to ignore. Bastogne was the microcosm of the larger war. What the Germans were besieging was not a battalion. It was a capsule of American industry, a fragment of a civilization that turned steel into resistance, gasoline into hope, and spreadsheets into ammunition. And this became even clearer with the reports from the ground. A 101st scorer wrote, "I even thought I wasn't going to see Christmas. But when I saw that sky opening up and the colorful parachutes descending, I understood. We were not alone." That was the most devastating effect of resupply, restoring morale. The supply was not only technical, it was symbolic. The strength of an army is not only in its cannons, it's in your ability to keep going, not to stop. And on that day, the message that descended from the sky over Bastogne was clear. The Americans were not there to retreat. They were there to last. And if the colored parachutes were a warning, what would come after would be execution. Because the next roar wouldn't carry supplies, it would carry warheads. From December 24th, the skies of Bastogne would gain a new function: offensive. Logistics had done its part. Now it was time for the artillery to respond, and he would answer, with industrial precision. In the late afternoon of December 23rd, while the last parachutes were still dancing over the icy wind of Bastogne, another sound began to cut through the silence. It was not the constant engine of the C-47s. It was higher-pitched, more aggressive, with a metallic timbre that mixed speed and death. They were the P-47 Thunderbolt, and they were not there to give hope. They were there to crush any attempt at reaction. With its rugged airframe and devastating armament, the P-47 was a fighter-bomber designed to do exactly what it would do that winter: make sure nothing moved on the wrong side of the line. Each plane could carry 8 50 machine guns, 500-pound bombs, and high-impact rockets. But its greatest asset was its range and endurance. In low flight, it was practically a winged tractor. The formations began to fly over the roads surrounding Bastogne. What had been, the day before, a steady stream of German supply trucks and armor was now a firing range. Entire columns were detected by forward observers and attacked relentlessly. All it took was one movement, a motor running, a man crossing a clearing, to trigger a steel dive. The Thunderbolts appeared out of nowhere, attacked in seconds, and disappeared above the clouds. The German reaction was immediate: paralysis. The frozen roads, which supported the front line with fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, became death traps. The units of Volksgrenadiers and Panzergrenadiers began to move only at night, in smaller columns and under camouflage. But the delay was inevitable. Many trains simply stopped. Trucks were abandoned. Anti-tank guns were buried under the snow to prevent them from being detected by the sun's reflection. German artillery, dependent on radio coordination and rapid movement, lost its fluidity, and with that, it also lost its effectiveness. The Luftwaffe, silence. There was no interception, there was no defense. The nearest German air bases were out of enough fuel for sustained missions. The few fighters available were reserved to protect Berlin. Bastogne was now given over to the total dominion of heaven. For the first time since 1940, the Wehrmacht found itself unable to operate in the open, and the scale of the operation was frightening. On December 24th and 25 alone, more than 500 P-47 sorties were recorded in the Ardennes region. Each one of them represented an explosion, a crater, a destroyed train. The average of ground attack missions reached 250 per day. For comparison, across the Eastern Front in that same period, the Luftwaffe had achieved just over 30 daily missions. Allied air supremacy was 8 times greater and concentrated on a single point on the map. If this proportion surprises you, it is worth remembering a fact that many German officers ignored. In 1944, the United States produced a new fighter every 5 minutes. While Germany tried to repair damaged planes with recycled parts, Douglas and Republic Aviation stacked new Thunderbolts in series. If this sounds unbelievable to you, write in the comments, "Shocking data." Because the real war, the war that was being won, didn't happen on the frozen soil of Belgium. It happened inside the factories. The moral impact was immediate. German troops began digging holes not only to protect themselves from artillery, but to hide from the sky. They began to move through dense forests where they could not be detected. They reduced radio communication to avoid triangulation. And the worst, they began to doubt their own doctrine. The lightning war that depended on mobility, speed, initiative, was now suicide. Mobility had become a death sentence. Major Heinrich von Brühl, communications officer of the 5th Panzer Division, wrote in his diary, "Our soldiers fear the sky more than rifles. At any moment, a tremor in the air announces the end of a battalion. It was a confession of impotence. The war had changed its axis. It didn't matter how many men Germany fielded anymore. It mattered what moved about them. The campaign in the Ardennes, thought of by Hitler as a strategic counterattack, became an exhibition of vulnerability. Every German advance was detected and intercepted. Every attempt to reinforce the siege of Bastogne was punished with surgical precision. And the final irony, the very planes that refueled Bastogne, the C-47s, were now escorted full-time, flying under the protection of heavy fighters, with continuous reconnaissance and attack cover. The American rear moved like an invisible army on the clouds. And then, on December 26th, something broke the line. It did not come from the sky, but from the south. A column was advancing, led by Sherman tanks, supported by armored infantry, tearing through the snow toward Bastogne. It was Patton's 4th Armored Division. The city would no longer be a siege. It would be a turning point, because when Patton arrived, the Americans stopped resisting, and they began to counterattack. On the night of December 26, 1944, the German trenches around Bastogne were immersed in the heavy silence of impending defeat. Many soldiers did not sleep, not because of the cold or fear of the enemy, but because of the awareness that something had changed irretrievably. It was not a superior order nor a military strategy that brought this feeling. It was something deeper, more inescapable. The realization that they were fighting a force they could not destroy, a force that went beyond courage or tactics. They were facing something that transcended the limits of conventional warfare. They were fighting a nation that could turn the sky itself into a highway. The encirclement that would once have seemed a simple matter of time to the Germans now turned out to be a logistical nightmare. On every battlefield, in every thwarted attack, what the soldiers saw were not just weapons or enemies. They saw the reflection of an American war machine powered by unlimited production capacity. Bastogne, with its unexpected resistance, became the symbol of a war where the power of industry was becoming the main weapon. What was once a traditional battlefield, where military superiority decided fate, was now a terrain where logistics, technology and numbers were playing a role that the Germans simply could not understand or tackle. German officers, as they wrote their reports as the night wore on, tried to keep up appearances. They used words like desperate resistance and temporary retardation, trying to sustain the illusion that they were still in control. But the soldiers in the trenches knew the truth. For them, the war had not officially ended, but something had already ended. Bastogne would not be taken. It was impossible, not because American resistance was insurmountable, but because the American machine simply wouldn't stop. With each new attack, with each new parachute launched from the sky, the German soldiers saw the reality of what they were facing. They could destroy tanks, burn trucks, capture positions, but what happened above their heads could not be fought. The planes dropping supplies over Bastogne weren't just delivering food or ammunition. They were delivering a message. You can't win. They can't compete with that. And as they watched the sky fill with aircraft that didn't miss the target or the message, the German soldiers' spirits began to break. For the Wehrmacht leaders, the battle was still ongoing. They kept their orders, their plans, and their calculations. But for the men in the trenches, the cards were already played. They understood that they were not only facing well-trained soldiers or audacious generals, they were faced with an industrial empire that had the ability to move mountains, or more accurately, to turn the sky into a means of logistical transportation. Every charge dropped, every colored parachute that descended in absolute precision, was evidence that the war had shifted from a matter of military tactics to a matter of production and technical capability. The planes that arrived were not just metaphors of resistance. They were the display of a system that remained operational while German resources were depleted. It didn't matter how many tanks or soldiers Germany could send to the field. It didn't matter how determined the attack was, because above them, Americans had the ability to refuel, restart, reinvigorate, reorganize, and do it all over again. It was the arithmetic of abundance versus desperate scarcity. The German officers who witnessed that air show could not help but feel helpless. What else could be done? They were besieging a city, and at the same time, they were besieging a concept they did not understand: the ability of the United States to overcome any logistical obstacle, to turn production into an invisible army. Modern warfare, as they would soon realize, was no longer just about maneuvering on the ground, but about how a nation could move resources more effectively and quickly than any enemy army. And, as the siege tightened around Bastogne, the idea of German victory was slowly shattered in the minds of the soldiers, not by a lost battle, but by a series of unseen events that were out of his control. American factories did not stop. The supply trucks never ceased. And above all, the planes continued to fly, fueling, reinforcing, renewing. The feeling of helplessness was not just a lack of food or ammunition. It was the desperation to realize that the war was now being fought on a completely different scale, where production and logistics were more important than any traditional military strategy. As the Germans continued their attacks, already with no hope of success, something began to take shape on the horizon. The siege of Bastogne had not yet been broken, but the spirit of the Wehrmacht was already being broken. What the soldiers saw in the sky and what they saw happening on the ground couldn't be more different. The battlefield was a limited physical space, but the battle for victory had been decided before in the Detroit factories and in the American industrial plants. The collapse that was happening in Bastogne was not only tactical, it was ideological. The war that Hitler and his war machine had planned was a war of rapid movements, of furious maneuvers, of individual courage. But the Americans were proving that modern warfare did not forgive those who underestimated the power of industry. And the most surprising, that was just the beginning, because in the coming days, a new, much more significant offensive would begin to completely transform the balance of the battle. And it wouldn't come from the ground. It would come from a new type of air attack, more devastating and precise, which would further accelerate the collapse of German confidence. On the same December 23rd, 1944, as the C-47s dropped supply packets that descended like a colorful rain over Bastogne, an even more surreal scene unfolded in the fields around the city. In absolute silence, gliders towed by C-47 planes began to descend, floating through the fog, with the precision of a meticulously planned war operation. Unlike transport planes that dropped their loads of supplies, gliders carried something even more impressive. Jeeps, doctors, mobile operating beds, even hospital equipment, and disassembled cannon parts. Each glider was a complete unit, capable of rebuilding a field hospital in the most inhospitable terrain, under enemy fire, and without the need for roads. The German soldiers, watching from their positions, could not believe their eyes. The war, they knew, was made up of slow marches, crowded trains, continuous mobilizations on congested roads. They were used to seeing what was possible on a traditional battlefield, where every move required thorough planning and the use of limited resources. But what they were witnessing on December 23rd was something else entirely. Gliders didn't need roads. They didn't need rail routes or any infrastructure that was vulnerable to air attack. They simply arrived with their precious cargo and settled on the battlefield. Within minutes, the camps around Bastogne were being filled with medical units, field tools, refrigerated blood, essential materials that, for the Germans, were beyond the reach of a surrounded army. No German division, not even the elite SS forces, possessed this level of flexibility and resilience. The Americans had created a modular war, where every part of the operation could be reconstituted, reinforced, and resupplied, regardless of the conditions on the ground. The encirclement, which to the Germans seemed like a definitive victory, was now beginning to disintegrate in the face of a resupply and replenishment capability that they could not comprehend. And the most surprising thing was the psychological impact of that. German soldiers were not just witnessing a supply operation, they were watching the response of an army that was able to rebuild its health system, its means of transport, and even its weapons, without resorting to any ground infrastructure. Modern warfare, as they had imagined, depended on control of roads, railways, and interdiction capacity. But what the Americans were showing was something different. A war where air control, instant mobility, and industrial capability allowed the battle to be driven by logistics without the need to physically occupy the terrain. The concept of modular warfare was becoming clear to the Germans, and the irony was immense. They were fighting a war machine that seemed to need no roads, no rails, no conventional infrastructure. The Americans did not need a besieged city to feed their forces. They fed their forces directly from the sky, with impressive accuracy and efficiency. The war the Germans had learned to wage, based on quick attacks, seizing points of strategic importance, now seemed obsolete. They were seeing a different war, in which the ability to resupply, to reorganize, and to reinforce an army outweighed any temporary territorial gain. This surprise was a heavy psychological blow. It was not only tactical defeat that was beginning to take shape. It was the recognition that the war had changed, that the balance of power was being decided by the ability to resupply and reorganize. To the German soldiers, this was incomprehensible. How can an army that is surrounded, that has no access to any road, receive a mobile hospital, refrigerated blood, and spare weapons? The answer lay in what they could not see: the immense industrial capacity of the United States, its relentless production, its technological adaptation. It was warfare made of modules, made to adapt instantly, made to operate without relying on anything the enemy could block. It was a lesson the Germans began to learn on the ground. It didn't matter how much they surrounded or cut off. As long as the Americans had control of the sky and production, any siege, any plan, any conquest could be reversed. If you're still impressed by this ability to adapt in logistics, imagine what would come next. Because what the Americans had done so far was not an isolated solution. It was just one part of a larger system. And soon, this system would show its power in an even more devastating way. As the sky over Bastogne continued to descend a rain of supplies, with cargo planes delivering ammunition, food, and hope, on the ground, the war was also about to turn in a way that seemed impossible to the Germans. General George S. Patton, known for his audacity and ruthless strategy, was on the move. On December 26, 1944, after days of preparation, Patton launched an offensive with his Third Army, breaking German expectations and facing almost impossible conditions to reach Bastogne and ease the siege. The idea of moving an armored army of 150,000 men, 600 tanks, and hundreds of support vehicles into enemy territory would already be a challenge under normal conditions. Now imagine this army moving over 100 miles of frozen terrain, with deep snow, partially destroyed roads, and troops that were still in the process of reorganizing after the first German attacks. Logistics, which had once been the mainstay of the American resistance in Bastogne, would now be tested to a new level, and the human factor became more critical than ever. But Patton, always on the lookout for bold solutions, used his military instinct and in-depth knowledge of the terrain to accomplish what many thought impossible. In a display of strategic flexibility, Patton not only moved his forces, but he did so with astonishing speed. He made use of all the techniques of mobile warfare that had already been tried and tested in previous campaigns. The tanks of his 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines at weak points identified during the advance, while the engineering units cleared the roads and provided the necessary support to maintain the advance. Every movement was calculated, every supply line interruption was immediately resolved. Meanwhile, Patton's command made quick decisions based on intelligence data without hesitation. The most impressive thing, however, was not the speed of the advance, but its effectiveness. While the Wehrmacht was focused on containing resistance inside Bastogne, Patton was rapidly approaching the encirclement with a continuous advance, leaving no room for the Germans to reorganize their defenses. American logistical superiority once again was the great trump card. The Third Army, which had been supplied continuously through transportation lines running at full throttle, was advancing without the kind of constraints that plagued the German armies, which were fighting against time and against a fragile and overburdened supply network. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, the defenders of the 101st, once hungry and almost out of ammunition, were now being fed and reinforced at an impressive rate. With each new supply pack that fell from the sky, the troops' morale soared, and as Patton approached, hope was renewed. The soldiers, who days earlier had been counting the last grains of rations, now found themselves prepared to fight again, with new weapons, fresh reinforcements and medical support. The doctors of the 101st, who had improvised operating rooms and used rudimentary methods to save the wounded, now had access to state-of-the-art equipment, refrigerated blood, and state-of-the-art medical resources. What once seemed like a desperate operation was now transformed into a model of strategic success. The interconnection between Patton's aerial refueling and ground mobility was demonstrating the superiority of the American logistics system. It was not just air power, but the ability to project a mobile force on the ground and maintain continuous supply that made the American response unbeatable. What the Germans saw and could not understand was that the siege was not an end. It was only a temporary obstacle, easily bypassed by a supply chain that never ran out. The arrival of Patton and his men at Bastogne was more than a simple relief to the besieged forces. It was the moment when the Germans realized that the reality of what they were facing was much more complex than they imagined. They had surrounded a city, but they were being surrounded by reality. War no longer depended on a tactical maneuver or quick victories on the battlefield. It would depend on the ability to keep the war flowing without interruptions, without gaps in supply. The psychological impact of Patton's arrival was immense for the German soldiers. That trust they had placed in the siege of Bastogne was beginning to crumble. The idea that they were winning was undone by the reality of modern warfare, where production and logistics dictated the pace. For the Germans, victory seemed within reach, but the American system had already turned the key to the counteroffensive, and the battlefield was about to change again. They were fighting something they couldn't destroy, a logistics chain that operated seamlessly from sky to ground with precision and effectiveness. As Patton broke through the German lines and entered Bastogne, the soldiers of the 101st found themselves not only physically strengthened, but also spiritually renewed. The German victory, which had once seemed certain, was now a mirage. The Wehrmacht soldiers, who had believed they were about to win, now found themselves facing the end of their operation. Defeat would not come from direct combat, but from the inability to combat a logistical and industrial system that operated with unbeatable precision. Modern warfare, as the Germans had learned the hard way, was a war in which the ability to resupply and regroup determined the winner. But the battle was not yet won. Patton had done his part, but there was more to be done. The siege of Bastogne had been broken, but the war in the Ardennes was far from over, and the real blow to the Germans was about to come with a new offensive. The air war, now a constant, would show its power once again, with an even more devastating impact. Even after the initial advances, when German forces were certain that victory at Bastogne was a matter of time, reality began to creep into the lines of command. On December 26, 1944, when the soldiers of the 101st Airborne were already being supplied and reinforced by Patton, Hitler, from his command in Berlin, demanded one thing: take Bastogne at any cost. The Führer's obsession with strategic control of the city was incomprehensible, given the desperate resistance that had formed there. The order to take Bastogne at any cost continued to be conveyed with blind certainty, even in the face of clear evidence that the siege was unraveling in the face of American logistical skill. The divisions remaining to support the attack, now including elite units such as the 1st SS Panzer, were thrown once more around the city. But with each move, Hitler's strategic mistake became more obvious. While he insisted on an impossible mission, his generals and high command officers began to realize that the situation was untenable. Each failed attack dug deeper into the chasm between the propaganda that still emanated from Berlin and the harsh reality on the battlefields. The German high command knew it was too late. Bastogne was no longer just a military objective, but a symbol, and as such, it became impossible to take. Each encirclement attempt, each new movement of troops, ended in a stalemate. The Americans resisted, bolstered by an air logistics network that kept the forces in the city supplied, rearmed, and morally invincible. In the German view, Bastogne had become a monument to the failure of his strategies. Control of the city, which had once seemed to be the key to the success of the offensive, now seemed an illusion. The elite divisions of the SS Panzer, accustomed to breaking through defenses with precision and speed, now found themselves in an insane fight against time and weather. Winter froze the tank engines and made it difficult to maneuver. Even with the formidable firepower, the troops were constantly being attacked by American air superiority. What could be resolved with speed and efficiency now stretched, unresolved, into a deadly stalemate. The irony of it all was overwhelming. Hitler's order, given with unfounded confidence, was digging the grave of his own strategy. The empire that had once prided itself on its swift and decisive victories was now locked in a conflict of attrition. And worse, the same Hitler, who had ignored the evidence in favor of his distorted view of the war, now put his best units on a futile mission. As the field leadership began to crumble, the soldiers, in the trenches and on the front lines, saw the true situation. American resistance was no longer just a matter of bravery. It was a direct reflection of a logistical system's ability to maintain a functioning army, no matter the distance or the difficulties. Bastogne wasn't falling. Bastogne was resisting because the American system was much more than an army. It was an industrial network that did not stop producing, that did not depend on roads, and that had a reach that the Germans could not even imagine. One of the German officers, during a post-war interrogation, would reflect on the situation. What we saw was not just a heroic defense. It was the materialization of a system of war that could not be defeated. They were showing us that they could rebuild what they wanted, where they wanted, without depending on what the land gave us. And this was the most bitter reality for the Germans. They were besieging a city that was being supplied by an invisible machine, more powerful than any direct fighting force. Now, with Bastogne's failure becoming more and more evident, the morale of the German troops was disintegrating. They were surrounding a victory that would never come, against an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources. Hitler's order, desperate and blind, only helped to accelerate the erosion of the morale of his own forces. The German military command was increasingly disconnected from the reality of the battlefield. The orders from above did not correspond to the situation on the ground. And this disconnection was the death of an empire that deep down no longer knew what it was pursuing. The fate of Bastogne, which until then seemed to be in German hands, began to be decided not by soldiers or tanks, but by the immense American industrial capacity to keep its forces supplied, well-equipped, and on the move. And as the American resistance proved more and more effective, the idea of German victory, which had seemed certain days earlier, began to fade. The Germans were encircling, but they did not realize that at the same time they were being surrounded by the immeasurable force of American war production. German reports became increasingly empty, with attempts to maintain the appearance of control. But inside the trenches, the soldiers knew the truth, and the truth was this: war, once again, was not won by individual courage or the capacity for destruction, but by the ability to sustain a war effort. And in this respect, the Americans had irrefutably outnumbered the Germans. But that was not the end yet. One last American offensive was to come, an offensive that would not only defeat the German forces at Bastogne, but that would change the war forever. When General Kokott, commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, met Colonel Harry Kinnaird after the war, he was genuinely surprised. In his mind, Kinnaird, the man responsible for coordinating all the logistics of the American resistance at Bastogne, was supposed to be a war-hardened veteran, someone with years of battlefield experience. But what he found was something quite different. Kinnaird did not have the appearance of a commander. His face, young and almost childlike, did not match the colossal responsibility he carried. The precision with which he had coordinated airdrops, the organization of supply zones, and the control of all the logistics of a besieged city all seemed impossible to Kokott in such young hands. But in that moment, he understood the magnitude of America's adaptation to modern warfare, a war that was based not only on experience, but on the ability to adapt quickly, to learn, and to react effectively to each new situation. For the Germans, the idea of a young man with so little experience leading such a complex and successful operation was inconceivable. In German military culture, experience was everything. Practice, years of combat, wisdom acquired on the battlefield were the most valued qualities. The leadership came from those who had gone through all the hardships, who knew the terrain and the enemy. It was a doctrine that was based on willpower, rigid training, and ruthless discipline. But the Americans, led by men like Kinnaird, were demonstrating something radically different, an almost instantaneous capacity for adaptation, a flexibility that the Germans could not comprehend. What the Americans had in Bastogne was not just an army. It was a decentralized network of command, where decisions could be made quickly and effectively, without the rigidity of an inflexible hierarchical chain. For Kinnaird, the key to success lay in the organization. The meticulously designed drop zones and the distribution of supplies to the encircled forces were coordinated with almost scientific precision. Americans didn't need large armies of experienced officers for every little decision. The system they had created allowed any commander at any level to make quick and effective decisions based on real-time data and reporting. This was in stark contrast to German doctrine, which depended on experience and the centralization of power. While the Germans discussed complex plans, the Americans were constantly adjusting and modifying their strategies, responding with speed to each change in circumstances. This contrast was not only tactical, it was in fact civilizational. Germany relied on a rigid military structure where experience and hierarchy were the pillars of the operation. But the United States, with its vast network of factories, engineers, and young leaders, relied on a more agile, more flexible model, where innovation and adaptation were the greatest virtues. And this was reflected in everything from the command on the battlefield to the industrial production that underpinned the war effort. For the Germans, the concept of decentralized warfare, where smaller units had the autonomy to act quickly without the need for direct orders from above, was unthinkable. They believed that the key to success lay in centralized command, the coordination of large forces, and the use of veterans' expertise. But the Americans were proving that the real strength lay elsewhere, in the ability to decentralize decisions, to rely on smaller units to act on data and the needs of the moment. This was perhaps the final blow to German military doctrine. They were used to a model where experience was worth more than innovation. And this was reflected in everything, in their tactics, in their strategies, and even in their expectations. Germany was not only being defeated on the battlefield, it was being defeated by a younger, more dynamic mentality that adapted quickly to the context, and that was already beginning to understand that modern warfare was not just a matter of brute force, but of flexibility and innovation. Kinard's arrival at the helm of all logistics at Bastogne was the culmination of this new way of thinking, and that's what made the difference. While the Germans were stuck in an antiquated view of war, the Americans, with young commanders like Kinard, were creating a new way of fighting, one that depended not on rigidity of experience, but on the speed of adaptation and the ability to react quickly to any situation. This was not just a tactical change, it was a change of mentality. And for German soldiers who were accustomed to a traditional war based on strength and experience, what they saw in Kinard and their American counterparts was something completely new and frightening. They were faced with an army that not only fought, but adapted and reorganized itself with a speed they had never seen before. And that is what defeated them, because modern warfare does not forgive those who do not know how to adapt. But the fight was not over yet. Bastogne's war was about to intensify. What the Germans didn't know was that the brains of the American resistance, that young colonel with a childlike face, were about to become one of the key players in a new wave of attacks, and that the Americans were ready to put into action a model of warfare that the Germans didn't even know existed. During the intense days of the siege of Bastogne, the numbers coming out of the battlefield were relentless. The American logistics machine, with its well-oiled machinery and driven by unparalleled industrial production, revealed an undeniable truth. Modern warfare would no longer be won by battle tactics alone, but by immense, almost unthinkable amounts of resources. The United States, in a show of industrial power, dropped more than 1,100 tons of supplies into Bastogne, including 15,000 artillery shells, nearly 8,000 gallons of gasoline, food for 15,000 men, and a host of vital items such as refrigerated blood, thermal clothing, radios, and tools. All of this came from a mobilization and production effort that took place thousands of miles away, but which always seemed within reach of the Americans. Meanwhile, on the German side, the scenario was devastatingly different. Wehrmacht commanders, who had hoped that the siege of Bastogne would be the final blow, were now facing a quiet but real humiliation. The Luftwaffe, which had once been the backbone of the German air offensive, was virtually absent. Hitler's air forces, which once dominated the skies, were reduced to a shadow of their former selves. No supplies were dropped to the encircled German troops. There was no capacity for that. Germany's logistical supply system was broken, and its infrastructure could no longer support even the most basic combat needs. No amount of bombs or artillery shells could correct the collapse of a system that could no longer keep its own soldiers fed, warm, or supplied with essential munitions. The numbers spoke for themselves. The United States delivered tons of resources that turned Bastogne into an impregnable point of resistance. But the greatness of this effort lay in its quantity. When you compared the American supply numbers with the logistical void on the German side, the difference was scandalous. While the Americans relentlessly dropped tons of food, ammunition, and war materials, the Germans could deliver absolutely nothing. The siege of Bastogne, which initially seemed to be a German triumph, became more and more proof that war was no longer a matter of individual courage or superior tactical skills. It was now a matter of industrial and logistical capacity. What was happening in Belgium was not just a military battle. It was a quantified humiliation, a logistical breakdown that the Germans could not get around. Bastogne thus became a microcosm of modern warfare. For the Germans, war had always been about tactics, ingenuity, and military strength. Hitler's strategy was based on quick maneuvers, where the effectiveness of the attack depended on speed and surprise. But what the Americans were showing was something very different. They weren't winning the war with faster tanks or with more powerful weapons. They were winning with numbers, with tons of supplies arriving when and where they were needed. And this difference in approach was not just tactical. It was a difference in civilization. The United States was playing an industrial war where resources were as valuable as the soldiers themselves. The comparison between the logistical efforts of the two sides became a visible embarrassment to the Germans. Bastogne was not just an American victory, it was a brutal lesson for the German soldiers and their commanders. The strength of an army was no longer just in its weapons or in its morale. It was, above all, in its ability to keep up the fight. The Americans were sending more than 1,100 tons of material to a besieged city, with no enemy able to do anything to stop it. And the Germans, who had surrounded the city, were now completely powerless, unable to sustain their own forces, let alone counterattack. And this humiliation was not just tactical, it was strategic. Because the numbers showed that the future of the war was being decided in production, in factories, on assembly lines, and in the control of logistics. The Wehrmacht, with its rigid hierarchical structure dependent on individual experience and initiative, could not compete with the coordinated industrial mobilization of the United States. Each C-47 transport plane that dropped supplies on Bastogne was proof that modern warfare no longer depended on courage or cunning. It depended on the ability to produce, distribute, and regroup, to keep a force intact as the enemy disintegrates in frustration. For the German soldiers, the difference was clear. They were fighting against an immense, invisible system, where every part of the war effort was interwoven into a network that could not be cut. They were trying to win a war with a broken logistical system against an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources, resources that arrived from the sky and the ground, day after day. And the numbers didn't lie. The United States was winning with tons, not with shots. The future of the war, as was clear in Bastogne, was decided by production capacity, and the figures for that production were undeniable. War was no longer a contest of forces, but of quantities, and the amount of resources the Americans had to sustain their armies was an advantage the Germans, with their limited resources, could not match. Now the Germans knew they were losing, not just the Battle of Bastogne, but the war. The siege had failed, and the American logistical system was proving to be more effective than any attack strategy. But what the Germans did not yet know was that the greatest lesson was about to be revealed. Modern warfare, with its immeasurable industrial capacity, would not forgive those who did not know how to adapt. The end was near. After the siege was broken, the war around Bastogne did not end. It transformed. Hitler, unable to accept the logistical and moral defeat that his own strategy had created, ordered further counterattacks. But they were not calculated, coordinated, or adequately supported operations. They were improvised attacks, launched in desperation, tanks sent into the field without air or infantry cover, grenadiers advancing on well-fortified American positions, illuminated by makeshift reflectors in the snow. Panzer units dispersed, trying to recover roads that no longer had any strategic importance. It was like watching a shadow trying to fight its own past. The doctrine that had once dominated Europe was now stumbling over its own insufficiency. In the first few days after the breakthrough, the Wehrmacht launched multiple attacks against the American defensive arc. Small groups of panzers, mostly Panzer IV models and a few remaining Tiger IIs, attempted to exploit gaps in the terrain. But each attempt ran into the inescapable reality: the sky belonged to the Americans. Every hour, new P-47 Thunderbolts appeared, flying low, plunging over German columns with 50 machine guns and rockets that destroyed armored vehicles as if they were paper targets. What had once been the Blitzkrieg's most feared weapon, the rapid advance of armor, had now become a sacrificial ritual. Panzers were detected by forward observers, marked on maps, and eliminated with near-industrial accuracy. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of German eyes from the beginning. You don't win a war of logistics by fighting as if it were a war of maneuver. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. With each thwarted attack, it became clearer that the Germans were insisting on a doctrine that had completely lost its meaning. The Blitzkrieg, built on speed and surprise, relied heavily on fuel, communications, and air cover, the very elements that Germany no longer possessed. The advance Hitler ordered could not be sustained by a phantom Luftwaffe, unable to field squadrons, while the Americans formed complete air corridors in the Ardennes. Nor could it be supported by an already dying supply network, with trucks being abandoned along the way and fuel depots reduced to smoke by American air operations. The Panzer Grenadiers, once the elite of mechanized mobility, now marched on foot, with rationed ammunition and makeshift clothing to face the cold. Armored vehicles that had once torn France apart in 6 weeks now advanced a few kilometers before being destroyed, bogged down, or abandoned for lack of fuel. The doctrine that Hitler continued to demand was, in fact, only an echo, an empty symbol of an era that had already ended. The post-Bastogne battlefield showed a Wehrmacht exhausted, pushed not by the belief in victory, but by the inability to admit that they had been overtaken by the very logic of modern warfare. American reports described the deterioration in stunning detail. In a single day, 28 panzers were destroyed in P-47 attacks. In another, an entire German tank company tried to advance along a forest road, only to be reduced to scrap metal in less than 20 minutes. The doctrine that had redefined warfare in 1939 was now being undone by the force that would redefine warfare in 1944, the dominance of the air. Germany could no longer move forces without being observed, marked, and destroyed. The battlefield was no longer a physical place. It was a place monitored, flown over, and controlled by logistical systems that the Germans could not match. And the psychological impact of this new phase was devastating. German soldiers, who had previously relied on the supremacy of their armor, now feared any distant noise. The deep roar of American radial engines meant only one thing, that the German advance had ended before it began. Panzer units, which had dominated Europe with almost supernatural rapidity, now became fixed targets, unable to hide from constant aerial surveillance. The Panzer myth, the image of an irresistible, steely, tactical machine, was being dismantled piece by piece, explosion by explosion. And, as if the humiliation wasn't enough, the logistical contrast continued to grow. While the Germans desperately tried to supply their tanks with remnants of destroyed depots, the Americans moved entire armored columns with continuous supply coming from convoys, planes, and safe routes. Every American advance seemed natural, fluid, guaranteed. Each German advance seemed like a suicidal effort. The difference wasn't just strategic, it was structural. By early January, many German soldiers already knew that any new attack was no longer a real attempt at victory, but a tragic formality. The military doctrine that had once defined modern warfare had been replaced by something new, something that Americans mastered. The Blitzkrieg had died. Not in a great clash of armies, but drowned in American gasoline, in endless supplies, on bombed-out roads that prevented any sustained advance, and there was still more to come. For while the panzers were being destroyed on the ground, a new number was about to reveal definitively why Germany could never win that war, a number that more than any explosion would expose the gulf between the two nations. In the interrogations conducted after the war, something curious emerged from the tired voices of the soldiers who had surrounded Bastogne. The same phrase repeated with an almost liturgical precision: "We are fighting against an industry." It was not a metaphor, it was a fact. In the frozen trenches, Each man had understood that he was not only facing American soldiers, it faced a system capable of replacing, expanding, and sustaining combat strength at a pace that defied any logic known to European armies. The psychological impact began on December 23rd, when the sky opened and revealed that the enemy had more planes than they had anti-aircraft ammunition. But it deepened when they saw that that flow did not decrease, did not stop, did not fail. Tons of supplies fell as naturally as a factory releases products on an assembly line. Bastogne appeared to be connected directly to Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, as if the entire American civilian infrastructure was connected to the battle through an invisible cord. For the Germans, whose logistics had already been on the verge of collapse since the summer, this was proof that they had been outclassed not only on the battlefield, but in the very conception of war. Their vision of conflict was still shaped by campaigns of movement, by mechanized columns, by rapid advance before the enemy could react. But there, before their eyes, was the cruel confirmation. The Americans did not need to react quickly. They could always react. Every package launched, every glider landed, every plane that ignored anti-aircraft fire reinforced this perception. The German soldier, his boots soaked and his ration rationed, knew that his army could not do the same. Its hospitals were out of anesthetics. Americans received refrigerated blood. Their units no longer had enough fuel for maneuvering. The Americans supplied tanks and artillery pieces without relying on any road. Their rifles, many of them outdated models, competed against a force that received constant replenishments of ammunition and weaponry. And after the initial shock came the most profound transformation, the silent collapse of morale. War, for many, is no longer a dispute between nations. It became a painful comparison between two worlds. On the one hand, a country that struggled with what it had left, squeezing bombed-out factories, extracting every liter of synthetic fuel, every miserable cartridge. On the other, a country capable of multiplying forces as if it had invisible hands spread across the entire continent. Interrogations reveal that in the days following the resupply, many Germans came to believe that they would not win even if they conquered Bastogne. The siege had lost meaning in the face of the scale of the American response. How to take down an enemy who could rebuild his own battlefield during the fight. There were no longer 22,000 men in Bastogne. There were 130 million moving the gear that supported those 22,000. This perception eroded the trust of entire units. Soldiers wrote in diaries that they were facing an adversary that does not tire, a machine that does not err, an army fed by factories. For the first time since the war began, it wasn't the commander who lost faith, it was the common men. They didn't just fear the shot, the grenade, the artillery. They feared the concept of a war that could no longer be won with courage, discipline, or technique. Logistics had become a psychological weapon, a constant reminder that human effort, no matter how great, could do nothing against an industrial system that transformed unlimited resources into uninterrupted military force. When they looked up at the sky and saw the C-47s circling like moving constellations, they didn't just see planes. They saw results, they saw production, they saw the inevitability. And this inevitability, more than any tactical defeat, dissolved the German spirit slowly, deeply, and irreversibly. Bastogne was, for the Americans, an act of resistance. For the Germans, it was the bitter revelation that they were fighting something they could not destroy. Modern warfare had become a factory, and the factory had no borders. And when this thought took shape among the soldiers of the Reich, defeat ceased to be a possibility. It became destiny, because what they would see next, in an even greater proportion, would confirm that Bastogne was no exception. It was the harbinger of a collapse that was already in motion. For decades, the Battle of the Bulge was remembered as a duel of courage, snow, and almost superhuman endurance. But behind the frozen smoke from the trenches, there was a silent truth, a truth that few realized at the time. but that would define all wars from then on. It was not just the bravery of the 101st, nor the ferocity of the German attacks that shaped Bastogne. It was something deeper, more structural, more invisible: logistics. While later narratives insisted on describing the siege as a struggle of men against winter, what really occurred was the clash between two military philosophies. Germany still believed that victory depended on brilliant maneuvers, fast panzer divisions, decisive blows delivered at the right time. The United States was quietly waging another kind of war, a war that was not measured in miles conquered, but in tons delivered. The American ability to move, supply, and rearm an isolated force under constant fire, without roads, and in the middle of the European winter was the factor that sealed Germany's fate even before spring arrived. Bastogne became the clearest sign. In the New World, the battlefield was not the forest, nor the city, nor the junction of roads. The actual battlefield was the supply map, the flow of materials, the invisible lines that connected factories to distant fronts. Every C-47 that crossed the sky proved this thesis. Each glider that landed showed that the enemy could no longer cut the American backbone. Individual courage was immense, but without the logistics that sustained it, it would be just a sacrifice in vain. The American army, for the first time in history, demonstrated that industrial intelligence could multiply lives, prolong resistance, reverse sieges. And as the Germans froze in the snow, stuck in a doctrine that no longer kept pace with the century, they discovered that they were fighting something bigger than soldiers. They were fighting an entire system. In the end, Bastogne didn't just teach that the United States could save a besieged division. He taught that they could redefine the concept of battle. But that lesson was not yet complete, because the next issue, revealed shortly after, would make it clear that American superiority was not just technical. It was structural, profound, and irreversible. For the survivors of the 101st Airborne Division, the colored parachutes descending on Bastogne were not mere utilitarian objects falling from the wintry sky. They were living signs that the war, for all its brutality, still allowed promises to exist, and that America kept every one of them. Reds, blues, yellows, whites, each color carried more than supplies. He carried the confirmation that even surrounded by 5 times their number, even without ammunition, without food, and without apparent hope, they were not abandoned. On a front where the smoke made the horizon indistinct, the colored sky marked the only fixed point, the absolute commitment of an entire nation to sustain those men until the last second. The soldiers would forever remember that, when all seemed lost, the sky spread its wings and embraced them. For many, this meant more than any tactical victory. It meant the discovery that war was not only an exercise of strength, but also of fidelity. In the trenches, men who shivered from the cold until they forgot their own names raised their eyes with the same reverence with which one looks at a miracle. Those parachutes didn't just bring ammunition, they brought dignity. They didn't just bring food, they brought faith. They did not just bring refrigerated blood. They brought the certainty that their lives mattered beyond the siege, beyond the map, beyond the war itself. It was a collective gesture, fueled by hundreds of factories, thousands of workers, and a logistical machine that transformed the national effort into an intimate gesture, the gesture of saving a man freezing in a Belgian forest. And for those who lived through it, the memory never dissolved. Even decades later, veterans were still thrilled to see a simple photograph of a supply parachute. It was as if, at that moment, they received back the feeling that someone thousands of miles away had thought of them at the exact moment they needed it most. The symbolic impact of that colorful sky went beyond the battlefield and spread beyond generations. In films, books, and exhibitions, whenever Bastogne is mentioned, the image that returns is the same. The sky dotted with colors. Not the destroyed tanks, not the artillery craters, not the frozen positions, but the parachutes because they represented something that war rarely offers: tangible hope. The classic narrative of resistance is attached to the frozen rifles, the trenches dug with bare hands, the bravely answered "nuts." But the memory that spans decades is that rain of colors softly falling on the white of the snow, as if the war itself had been painted by an unexpected hand. For the Germans, it was the moment of bitter recognition. For Americans, it was the moment of renewal. And that's why, when the battle ended, many soldiers said that Bastogne wasn't won by tanks, nor by strategy. It was won by the message that fell from the sky. Those parachutes have become part of the emotional vocabulary of American memory. In schools, children learned that a country's strength lies not only in its armies, but in its ability to sustain those who fight on its behalf. In veterans' families, stories were told, not as tales of destruction, but as memories of unity. And, in the testimonies recorded decades later, the men of the 101st still described that moment with a simple phrase: "The sky was on our side." Not as a metaphor, but as a natural conclusion, because it really seemed that nature itself, once hostile, had become complicit. The cold continued, the shots continued, the siege continued. But now there was something above them that could not be brought down by tanks, nor by grenades, nor by any order from the German High Command. He was an absolute, indestructible ally. This legacy was not limited to the memory of the combatants. He shaped American military identity for decades to come. The view that no soldier would be abandoned, that logistics are as valuable as courage, that a nation should be able to reach its men wherever they are. All of this was cemented in that frozen moment in December. Later doctrines, from the Korean War to the Gulf War, would carry this lesson. Bastogne has become a symbol of a promise that for the United States, distance is no excuse and abandonment is not an option. And that promise echoes whenever the phrase, "the 101st would never surrender," is remembered. It does not refer only to the moral decision of the soldiers, but to the logistical pact that gave them the ability to fight. But above all, what remained was the human impact. When veterans were reunited decades after the end of the conflict, many said they would never forget the sound of the planes, the opening of the doors, the beginning of the slow fall of the parachutes. Some said that at that moment they felt that their unborn children were already calling them back home. Others claimed that it was the only time in the war when they truly believed they would live to see the end of it. And this shared emotion is what cemented Bastogne as not only a military landmark, but a moral one. It was the point at which an army realized it could resist, not because it was indestructible, but because it was not alone, and because its nation had deliberately chosen to sustain it to the last man. And yet, the greatest revelation in history was yet to be told. Because, when one finally analyzes the final numbers of that operation, a hidden detail, rarely cited, definitively exposes the gulf between the two nations. A number so brutal that for many Germans, it represented the real end of the war before the armistice. When the German soldiers looked up that morning of December 23rd, they understood something that no campaign manual had prepared to reveal. The war they believed they dominated had ceased to exist. The Blitzkrieg, with its belief in speed, shock and precision, had died the instant 241 American planes broke through the clouds and turned the Belgian sky into a supply highway. From that moment on, the German military collapse ceased to be a hypothesis and became an inevitable trajectory. They surrounded Bastogne with confidence, hoping to repeat the pattern that had so often earned them quick victories. But what they witnessed was the confirmation that without fuel, without production, without industrial capacity, no tactics would survive. The siege fell apart before Patton's first tank touched the city's frozen streets. It fell apart the very second the Germans realized they were fighting something their divisions could no longer reach, a war economy that stretched beyond the horizon, sustained by factories that never slept. From that day on, no matter how many officers shouted orders, how many maps were redrawn, how many counterattacks Hitler demanded, morale was broken, conviction evaporated, the strategic logic that had sustained the Reich dissolved in the face of American material superiority. The battle continued, but the war for them was already over. The lesson that Bastogne left for history is as simple as it is ruthless. Tactics can win battles. Logistics wins wars. Germany had hardened veterans, feared weapons, and experienced commanders. The United States had an invisible force that projected itself into every C-47, every glider, every ton dropped from the sky. It was the combined strength of thousands of workers, miles of assembly line, trains that crossed oceans, industrial policies that transformed raw materials into military power. Bastogne proved that courage without supply is only honor destined for sacrifice, while supply allied to courage turns into inevitable victory. In the modern era, war is no longer defined by the frontier of the battlefield, but is decided in the depths of national economies, in the rhythm of factories, in the volume of reserves. The 101st resisted because it was supported by a structure that could not be besieged. American industrial production. And that's the great truth that echoes from that frozen forest. The soldier fights, but the industry wins. Years later, a German general would summarize the entire tragedy of the Reich in a phrase as crude as it is true. We were defeated by trucks. He didn't just talk about vehicles. He spoke of the entire chain that made them possible. An admission that carries all the irony of this story. The Wehrmacht did not lose its last major offensive for lack of bravery, but for lack of oil, steel, rubber, and substitutes. If you value historical research and want stories like this to continue to be revealed with depth and respect for the facts, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This helps us to keep the search for truth alive. And share in the comments which data from this video shocked you the most. The tons dropped, the number of planes, the collapse of German morale, or the perception that the war was decided off the battlefield. Also, activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical event that we are preparing. But before you leave, take a deep breath and keep your eyes on the horizon. Because Bastogne is just a cog in a larger cog, a point where the world realized that the future of wars would be written by whoever controlled not the road, but production. And this story continues. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next real story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another amazing story.